Okay, this is lecture 9, chapters 13 and 14 of Armitage and Braddick. And let's get the notes up here for us. Okay, as you may recall, or may not, I am actually a world historian, and there's two ways of thinking about world history. One way is sort of things expanding, which a lot of this book has been about. Historians who are focusing on one area and then their position or their area of exploration begins to expand, and soon they come to encompass it as a whole world, Atlantic world system, and so they see the connections on both sides of the Atlantic and through the Atlantic and things like that. But initially they started off at the local and kind of grew larger. That's one way of viewing world history, is you start reframing your field of vision to larger and larger spaces, and you see the connections in between. Another way of doing world history is you see the whole system as a whole, as a global entity in which the Atlantic world is one part of it. So in these two essays here today, 13 and 14, we have Elliott's Atlantic history, which is about this sort of envisioning how Atlantic world history grew into one larger way of viewing the world. And opposite, we have Benton's approach, which fits this Atlantic world into a larger world structure. All right, so let's start with chapter 13, Elliott. Elliott, he takes the view of the English view of the Atlantic up through the 18th century. When people in the British Islands talked about the Atlantic, they were really talking about the North Atlantic, according to Elliott, and which was centered around, or one of the areas that was first incorporated into the system was the Newfoundland fisheries, which was this rich fishery grounds that the British muscled in on. And to facilitate their use of this fishery, they established some temporary camps on the coastline in order to dry the fish they caught, and also to serve as a base camp for the fishing they were doing. But these camps were temporary. But this initial vision of what the Atlantic is for the English, as Elliott refers to them, is this sort of northern sector. So this North Atlantic section really comprises a big part of the English view of the Atlantic world, which begins to change through the latter stages of the 18th century and into the 19th century. So this idea of Atlantic history has its own sort of intellectual history, and it's drawn upon the work of a man by the name of Ferdinand Braudel. And Braudel wrote a massive work on the Mediterranean Sea in the age of Philip II. And what Braudel viewed the Mediterranean is not just as the physical part of the water itself that sloshes up against the shore of two continents, but is actually a larger world that connects far from those shorelines. And so in the beginning part of this book, where Armitage and Braddick are laying out this sort of intellectual foundations of that, you can see a lot of this Braudelian view of the Atlantic world in a similar context as Braudel saw the Mediterranean world. So it's not just a world that is physically the water and shoreline itself, but it connects far out. So this new Atlantic history relies upon Braudel, and it seeks to expand out these linkages. But there are some important differences, as Elliott points out. One is that this Atlantic world is a European creation. It could not exist before Europe, and Europeans were the ones that created it by their practices of sailing and trading across it. So what Elliott wants to argue is that instead of seeing this as one Atlantic world system, that's where it ends up. But it begins with three distinct systems. Right, so we talked about the northern system, which was centered around the Newfoundland fishery. This is the one that the English would be most familiar with. The second system is the Spanish, Caribbean, and Mesoamerican circuit, which is the circuit of Spanish exploration and then colonization, and then the delivery back to Spain of this river of gold and silver. The third Atlantic centers around, he calls the Luso-Atlantic, which is Portugal, Africa, and Brazil. And it's that circuit of the African slave trade run by the Portuguese, including their islands off the coast of Africa, as we've already discussed previously, and delivering that plantation system to the New World. And so that circuit is a separate Atlantic world. What happens over time is that these circuits begin to merge. So throughout the 17th and 18th century, these circuits merge into one Atlantic world system. So what Elliott wants to argue is that it doesn't, it's a process that evolves to encompass the entire Atlantic. It's not something that appears magically when Europeans start sailing it. It's the use and thickening of those connections and overlapping of those connections that lead to one Atlantic world. So one of the things about this essay is that Elliott's talking about how Atlantic world history developed. And there's a couple aspects to that. First, he says that Atlantic history started as a national history in which you wanted to look at Liverpool sailors in Liverpool and then follow them to various places. But your center of focus is really on Liverpool. What happens is as you follow these Liverpoolian sailors around the world, they become caught up in a system that is a global system. The Atlantic slave trade, commodities, we talked previously in Klein's book talking about how one of the major trading items for slaves in sub-Saharan Africa were Indian textiles, the calicos as they were referred to. So those calicos tie the Liverpool port into India, the Indian Ocean trading system to acquire these things. And so they become, in order to follow this story of Liverpool sailors, you end up following them all around the globe in some fashion. So your story begins to broaden out as you follow these folks. But initially it starts with just a sort of national focus. So you're focused on the colony of Georgia. And as you focus on the colony of Georgia, you want to talk about what colonists settled at. And then you come to realize that some of the colonists that were sent there as penal colonists from the British Empire. Then you find that those penal colonists many of them were Irish rebels. And so that ties you into the history of British occupation or English occupation of Ireland. All those things expand out because you were focusing on who the colonists are in Georgia. So Elliott says this book is mainly about connection. So you're following the migration of people. You're following the economic aspects of the fur trade, right? So these are all things that you're tracing the connections, and from that, it's leading to a wider discussion. Elliott says that something that's not been done, but that is a fruitful area of research, or something that could be done far more often, especially in the English language view of the Atlantic, is a study of comparison. So an easy comparison is to make the study of slaves in Spanish systems and English systems, right? So that sort of comparison stuff, it's somewhat done, but Elliott thinks it could be done much more. And he says this has been done by Spanish historians writing in Spanish. And so it would do good for historians in the English-speaking world who are interested in the Atlantic world to spend some time reading the literature that Spanish historians have been producing for 50-odd years or more. So, and they have been doing quite a bit of comparison, according to Elliott. So he calls this the creation and destruction of communities in the system. It's sort of, it fits that theoretical formulation of circumnavigation we saw at the start of the book. He also proposes a counterfactual, and counterfactuals can be really useful, but one must be careful about them. They can be really useful because they highlight or illustrate how changing one aspect gives you a different perspective, and it also gives you a new perspective on how things operate. So counterfactuals are things that could have been, but are not. And the best counterfactuals are one where you change one element and then try and follow through in a logical progression how the responses would be different. So his counterfactual centers around the idea that instead of Christopher Columbus going to the Spanish crown, he went to Henry VIII and got funding from Henry VIII and was sailing for England as opposed to Spain. And so then he plays out what things would have been different. And what he argues in his counterfactual is that many of the same things, the same patterns you see as a that unfurl in real history of Spain as a colonizing power in the New World. If you plug England in there, the broadest patterns would be similar. This is a way of looking at what kind of things are the engine of historical change. It's not the personalities of Philip II or Henry VIII or any individual character. It's the systems that they're plugged into, right? So if England became the colonizing power, then they wouldn't have broken with the Catholic Church, and there would have been this flood of money into England, and then, you know, he follows that through. The idea is to use that example to help illustrate the process. Coming back to real history, the colonies developed, as we have seen in several functions, relatively autonomously, without a firm control by the central power in the British Atlantic world. In the Spanish world, there's a much tighter grip, as we have seen. This process of evolution is something that grew over time, and when the state, the empire, the British Atlantic Empire, decides to rein these colonies in, they were pretty far down the pike in autonomous development. So in the early stages, developing autonomously was not all that big a deal, and there was not much the British could do about it anyway. But as they sought to rein things in, it proved to be pretty momentous, and we call that here in the United States the American Revolution. So Elliott's vision of Atlantic world history is one that it grows up into this sort of larger examination from fairly large circuits before, but they combine to become this one giant Atlantic world. Lauren Benton is a world historian who's approaching this differently. She says, instead of thinking about this as a system that grows up, and viewing the Atlantic world system as a separate system from the Indian Ocean system, Benton says you can much more profitably see both as part of a global system, and both that and more, as a matter of fact. So Atlantic perspective, if you begin with the global processes and then examine how things operate in the Atlantic, and then compare and contrast to other regions in this global British Atlantic world, or British world, empire world, I should say, Atlantic world. The Atlantic is just one part of a much larger global operation. In this case, by seeing it in that way, you place the metropole at the center of a global network of connections. So this is the British ruling authority reaching out around the globe, in which very sophisticated systems evolve, but they're all part of a larger web or whole that is the British world empire, I guess, operation, expansion. So this is a conscious decision by the British Crown to expand their trade, right? And as they expand their trade in a variety of places, the connections both back to the mother country and also between the colonies begin to thicken up. So the more the trade is expanded, the more trade moves along it, and the firmer connections can be. So this is not just like a regional trade, it's a global trade, right? But it's a global trade that's centered around the metropole. You see some, but not a lot of trade between the American colonies and the Indian Ocean system. Right? So the Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean system engage in some measure of trade, but primarily its focus is back to that center, the metropole. And she argues that these developing systems are not separate, but they're interconnected. They're interconnected because they're part of a global system. And so she says the way to think about British Atlantic history is to see it as part of two phases. There's the early period, the 16th century to 1690. 1690 she chooses quite deliberately because this is after the Glorious Revolution has been put into place, and then from 1690 to the end of the 18th century. So she's looking at these two phases of the system. And within that system, she's going to examine the British Atlantic world not in isolation, but as part of a global system. So before you can do things like that, you have to lay out the lay of the land, I suppose. So the traditional view is that the English were seeking to get to the east, right? So there are voyages of exploration, particularly in the northern Arctic regions, were about trying to find a way to sail directly to Asia, for the same reason that the Spaniards tried to sail directly to Asia, so that they can cut out the middlemen and establish their own trading relations, right? So that's the traditional view. The English never find that fabled Northwest Passage that they seek, which, as a small side note, the global climate change is shrinking the polar ice cap, so that there is now a Northwest Passage that the English sought 400 or 500 years ago, right? So, so this traditional view has them bumping into that, but and Benton says, yeah, sure, that's part of it, but it's much more than that. When the English begin to sail out, they're not just trying to find a way directly to Asia, they're trying to push into this global trade market that's centered around the goods of Asia. And so they're trying in all sorts of ways to get into this global trade market and make more money for the empire, because this is the way they foresee the expansion of the British Empire. So getting east, as I suggested with the Spanish, that's the initial drive for Europeans in general. They're trying to get to that lucrative trading system that's centered around China and the Indian Ocean system, right? When the English tap into it, they're at a disadvantage, because they really have nothing that the people in this system want. They're not particularly interested in the products of England. Wool is not a big seller in the Indian Ocean system. So that means they have to pay with hard currency, gold and silver. This is something that the English were seeking to get around. They're trying to find some way to not deplete their coffers all the time to buy these goods. It's difficult. So this business, the luxury trade, we saw it previously in our discussion in this book. Luxury trade and status symbols are a sign of your wealth and power, right? So we talked about the suggestion that you can invite someone to tea. Tea is imported from the Far East, and you can offer them 1 lump or 2 of sugar, a very expensive commodity in the colonies, that you are demonstrating your wealth and power by offering them freely. Feel free to sweeten your tea with extra sugar if you want, right? So these are things that are purchased with hard currency usually. When the British penetrate this Indian Ocean system, you have 2 large circuits of trade and interconnection, right? We've spent most of this the last couple of months talking about the Atlantic system, but the Indian Ocean is also a thriving trading system too that the British are trying to muscle in on, right? This was initially a Portuguese, then the Dutch muscled in, and now the British, a little late to the party, are trying to muscle in on this trade as well. So there's the establishment of British colonial power in the Indian Ocean system. And Benton, whose work is on global law as it's manifest in different entities, and uses those as points of comparison. That's what her research centers around. Says, when you look at the Indian Ocean world and the Atlantic world, they're wrestling with the same questions as being part of this greater British empire, global empire. One is the delegation of authority, right? The state is strong enough to send these forces out, but it doesn't have a firm enough control that it can control events at the local level. So there's you have to deal with how do you allow these colonies to govern, right? It can't be, because they're not, the distance and time and control is too long to issue direct rule in these places. So there has to be some delegation of authority. We've seen in the Atlantic colonies that they evolved their own sort of loose governing structure under the British umbrella. So they are given quite a bit of autonomy to run their own governments, right? In the Indian Ocean system, this is also a much more contested system, because the Portuguese are there, the Dutch are there, plus all the other people who are part of the Indian Ocean system. So the British create a company called the East India Company, right, whose task is to operate as in lieu of the state. They're a quasi-state, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. The second issue that they wrestle with in both the British Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean system is this idea of your citizenship rights. Are you a co-equal British citizen? Do you have a subordinate status because you're a colonist? These are issues that are murky, they're unclear. And partly they're unclear because people aren't locked into one place all the time, right? You have colonists who came from Ireland looking to get rich in the Virginia colonies. Some of them return, right? So it's not like their rights change. It's just over time, as people are born in the colonies or stay in the colonies, it's an open question about what their citizen rights mean. So in the Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean system, two different answers are created. In the Indian Ocean system, there's the creation of something known as the East India Company. This is a quasi-state actor, and quasi-state means partially state, partially private. So the East India Company operates instead of the British state, right? So they are given a lot of autonomy to run things. They operate, they can negotiate treaties, they have their own standing army. So they have a lot of power, state-like powers, but it's a private company that's owned by stockholders. And many of these stockholders are members of the parliament and the aristocracy. So there's quite a bit of overlap between government actors and this entity known as the East India Company. In the West, the colonial system largely developed along the idea of charters, right? So a charter was granted to some adventurers from Ireland who were going to create a lucrative colony in the New World that's going to make them money as private investors, right? The Puritans come with their own charter. They're going to establish a pure, godly colony as they see it. They have received permission from the British Crown, so they have their charter, but in terms of how they run the colony itself, it's entirely up to them, right? So in the Atlantic world system, there's much more of this development. There is the attempt to create a West India company that operates in the same fashion that the East India does, but it's never quite as effective, and it's really largely centered on the African slave trade. So what Benton argues is that in the 18th century, these questions are resolved in different ways, and the histories of the Indian Ocean system and the Atlantic world begin to diverge, right? So they go off in different trajectories in terms of citizenship rights, in terms of how these things are governed. They begin to diverge and evolve in their own direction, but the thing to keep in mind is that they're still part of the same British world, right? So it's not a separate entity. And one of the examples that illustrates this nicely is Sir Grantham, who has his adventures in the American colonies, has his adventures sailing with the British Navy in some sort of combat with Algerian pirates, and then has his adventures serving as an agent in the Indian Ocean. This one individual touched three aspects of this global British world, and he didn't put on a new hat in each place. He was the same entity performing the same roles because he's part of the same system. That's what Benton is arguing. So as these systems diverge, there is an attempt, because the British state has gained more power and now is willing and able, it may have always been willing but unable, to start projecting more control over their overseas possessions. So after 1763, this French and Indian War, as we call it here in the United States, the 7 Years' War as they call it in Europe, this was a European conflict that played out a great deal in North America, but it also had an Indian Ocean component as well. So as the result of the 7 Years' War, this resolution of conflicts between European states, the British Empire seeks to tighten control. They succeed in the Indian Ocean, right? The government replaces the East India Company, that quasi-public company, quasi-state and private entity, replaces it with direct British parliamentary control. This is partly because the East India Company went bankrupt, right? But it fails in North America. We call that the American Revolution, where the attempt to tighten British control and direction over the colonies was met with rebellion that the colonists won, right? So these efforts to tighten control for Benton are not separate. They're part of this larger attempt by the British state to extend its power. By seeing the British Atlantic in its global aspects, we see it as part of an open-ended, interconnected process, right? So it's not the Atlantic world in one box and the Indian Ocean in another box and the British home isles in this fashion, or even separating out the North American colonies from the Caribbean colonies. What Benton argues is they're all part of this global system and is seeing it as part of a larger whole. We can fit its trajectory and its history into this larger discussion of the British world. That is the last essays from our British Atlantic world. There's one more lecture that I will do on Morgan and the run-up as these issues of the British attempt to control their colonies play out here in the North American colonies in what becomes the United States. This is a discussion of British efforts to establish control following the French and Indian War. So that's what we will talk about next. And then that will be the last lecture. And there's a film that will be linked up on Blackboard as well. All right.